Okay, it's been said that the longest journey begins with a single step, and that's exactly the way we're going to start. We're going to take our very, very first step into the idea of NSX as a security and network virtualization utility. And again, I'm going to return to the focus of the idea of the Network Foundation Protection Guidelines. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to make a matrix. And in that matrix, what I'm going to do is on the beginning, on the left side, I'm going to have what I referred to as my plane of operations. Planes of operations. Now also, it's going to be important for us to understand that we will be installing resources in each of these planes of operation. I will begin with the management plane. It also becomes important that these resources that we're going to be talking about will need to be able to communicate with one another. And in order to be able to communicate with one another, they're going to need communication agents. Now, communication agents, we have them, as an example, we have like a RabbitMQ inside of things like Cisco Cloud Center that allows it to be able to control resources. So it should come as no surprise that we're going to use equivalent to these. If not, in fact, we'll find that we'll be using a variation of RabbitMQ inside of NSX. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at this from the perspective of what we would refer to as an NSXV deployment. Now there's going to be another series that's going to cover NSXT with regard to the idea of setup and configuration. Operation, it's still, NSX is still pretty much NSX as far as what it is we're working with and how we're doing things. But just keep in mind that right now we're focusing purely on NSXV because it's the easiest to get our hands on. It's also the easiest to get emulation with. If you don't want to build your own lab, I'll cover by the end of the series a way for you to be able to access resources where everything's already running. You're already licensed for vSAN, and it'll cost you maybe about $80 a month. So that's not through Micronics, that's through another service, but I will cover that by the end of the class. Now, when we start looking at what's going on, there are some constructs that we need to be mindful of that we already exist or that we already have, and we've already discussed one of them. Actually, let me change over to a yellow pen color. So what we're going to have here is we have inside the management plane, we have something called the Vcenter Server Appliance, the VCSA. Now, the VCSA is an old product, and the VCSA, well, old for VMware, and it has gone through a number of iterations and changes. We are currently using ESXi 6.5. I'll go ahead and put that in here. So we'll say ESXi 6.5. It's not the latest and greatest, but it's based on what I have and what I can walk through and do demonstrations with. Now, the VCSA server is the management resource that allows me to manage every host that's going to be connected to this vSphere extended domain, which means we're going to need the Enterprise Plus licensing. We're going to need a number of things that we're going to be working with, but keep in mind that the VCSA doesn't come from VMware with any advanced features. In fact, when it comes right down to it, until the advent of NSX, the only thing that we could really do in VMware was do logical switching. If we had to actually send traffic between port groups or between VLANs, that traffic had to leave the SXI host out of the uplink, go to its attached switch, get sent to the aggregation layer where it could touch layer 3, get routed, and then sent back down. Now what that means is that the majority of what we call east-west traffic, so if I have two VMs, so if I have a host all the way down here, so I have an ESXi host all the way down here, so ESXi, let's just say 1 for the sake of argument. And inside of ESXi 1, we actually have two VMs. I have virtual machine 1, and I'll do in a different color, virtual machine 2. And the two different colors are denoting the fact that they're in two different port groups. To speak to one another, the traffic has to travel out of the SXI host, up the uplink, to whatever switch it's connected to, so whatever layer 2 switch that we're working with. And this would be something like an 802.1q tunnel. And then ultimately that layer 2 device is going to actually be connected to some type of layer 3 infrastructure. So when we start looking at this, that means for these two machines to talk to one another, the traffic actually has to travel from ESXi1 to the layer 2 switch to the layer 3 boundary and then get routed back down. And this is what we talk about east-west traffic needing to travel north-south. And it's not a very efficient use of configuration when we take into account that a lot of things happen inside of virtualization now. When we start looking at things like desktop infrastructure, it's actually being implemented in the hypervisor in a lot of different instances. Whether we're using VMware, whether we're using Citrix, it really doesn't matter. Virtual desktop infrastructure exists. And to communicate between a server in the hypervisor, even if it's in the same hypervisor, as long as I'm in separate port groups, that means that I'm going to have to be routed because the port groups represent VLANs in the outside world. Now, the question becomes, why don't we put some type of enhanced routing functionality? What if I had some way of being able to implement a layer 3 construct inside of the hypervisor? Cisco makes CSR 1000 Vs. I can install them today. They come in an OVA. I can slap it inside the ESXi host, and I can actually do routing inside of the hypervisor. But if I have 20 of these, every one of these is going to be managed via an IP address. And if I have hundreds of these, it becomes, at the end of the day, pretty untenable. Now, Cisco's solution to this is the idea of being able to do something like the ACI with a VMM domain. VMware's solution was Nsx. Now, what VMware decided to do is they decided to create a virtual machine, and they call it the Nsx Manager. Now, the Nsx Manager is exactly what I said. It's a VM, so it's a virtual machine. And as being a virtual machine, it's going to be installed inside of a host somewhere in my infrastructure. Now, what I'm going to do is when I install the Nsx Manager, I'm actually going to register the Nsx Manager with the Vcenter server appliance. And once I do that, we'll actually get a little Nsx icon that we can use to manage things inside of the VCSA. Now, this registration process is important, and it also needs to be noted that this is a one-to-one relationship between Nsx managers and VCSA appliances. Whether we're looking at the implementation here, it's a one-to-one. Do not lose sight of that fact. And we also need to entertain the fact that this needs to be implemented in some type of secure fashion. And I want to talk about how, and I want to talk about why it's important for us to implement it. But before we do, and before we dive into any in-depth configuration or conversation about theory, let's go ahead and get this thing made, because it's going to take some time to actually get the Nsx Manager installed. And then what I want to do is I want to walk through the process of integration. So we'll leave this up on the lightboard. We're going to dive into the demonstration and the installation of the Nsx Manager. And then what we're going to do is we're going to follow this mechanism all the way down as we go from the management plane to the control plane to the data plane. And then once that infrastructure is in place, you're at a perfect stepping off point for exploring the advanced features and capabilities of Nsx security and network virtualization. I'll see you guys in the next video.